Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Slisher and this is a show about astrology, and today we're going to be talking about the sign of Gemini. Every month we change into a new sign, and Gemini runs from May the 20th into June the 19th. Gemini is a mutable air sign. What that means is that immutable means it's an adaptable sign. As I mentioned, there's three different modalities. You'll get into them as we get over the course of the instructions here. But a mutable air sign is one that's more adaptable. In other words, they are more compliant. They're more willing to move and adapt to others. They're not fixed, as some signs are. There's fixed signs, there's cardinal signs, and there's mutable signs. Gemini is a mutable sign. There's four mutable signs. There's Gemini, which is mutable air. There's Virgo, which is Gemini earth. There's Sagittarius, which is mutable fire. And then there's Pisces, which is mutable water. Mutability means that they are adaptable. They are more willing to comply. They're more willing to try to adjust. They're more flexible. They're more willing to try to meet you halfway. And whether you're in an air sign, as Gemini is an air sign, that means all of the activity in this person's takes place in their head. Geminis are incredibly cerebral, incredibly curious, and very, very busy-minded people. These are people that never stop talking. I don't mean that in a bad way. That's not, if they're not talking personally outwardly, they are thinking inwardly. They are constantly churning. These are people who typically have a very difficult time sleeping because they think so much. They're always thinking, always turning things over. And as a result of that quick thinking, they tend to just hit the tops of the peaks of topics sometimes. They don't always have the depth to go into this deeper. That's a broad generalization. It doesn't mean that all Geminis are superficial or somewhat insensitive, because they may have other characteristics in their chart, which you can find out by contacting me at turningofthewheel.com to get your official chart. Once you know the basics of your birth chart, which is based on the birth day, the birthplace, and most importantly, the birth time, then we know where the planets are in your particular chart, which is considered to be your owner's manual. When you know that, then you know exactly what's going to be happening in your life. The Gemini, to get back to the Gemini, again, a mutable air sign. So it's all about the conversation. It's all about the intellect. It's all about being curious. Research, talking, communicating, writing, anything that has to do with outward expression is the realm of the Gemini. Gemini it's represented by the sign of the twins. So we can see with twins, we have this constant churn of ideas going through. And that's exactly what it's like to be a Gemini. Geminis also have this remarkable ability to do many things at the same time. Geminis, if you know anybody in your life who's a Gemini or who has a Gemini rising sign, or a Gemini moon for that matter, you will find a person who is able to do, where most of us can do 2 or 3 things at once, they can do 4 or 7 things at the same time. This is the type of person a Gemini is. They're very much like a juggler. They can do a little bit of this, they can do a little bit of that, back and forth and back and forth. Very quick-witted, very quick-minded, and they love to communicate. Anybody who has a strong Gemini in their chart, and we'll go through all the houses later, you will see this capacity and how it manifests itself in their lives. It's very, very powerful and incredible. You will know a Gemini by the person who loves to talk. In that capacity of talking becomes this great ability to sort of just say what's ever on their mind. It's almost as if they haven't got a governor on their mind in some ways, and they will say whatever's on their mind, which sometimes can get them into trouble. They can be impulsive, they can be tempestuous, they can be flip-floppy. They can, the idea of the twins is sort of, they may have this duality to them, whereby they may feel one way one moment, and then the next minute they change their mind, they go the other way, or their plans change quite a bit in their lives, and they tend to be very scattered sometimes, because their minds are so busy. This is not a negative, this is simply an observation. A person who's very active, very, very active in their minds, always churning, never has a chance to slow down. So as a result, their whole temperament is kind of nervous sometimes. They're like electric. You know, there's a sense of nervous energy that's always there, and they can't seem to shake it. Now, this can be a very beneficial quality because it allows them to be incredibly creative. Some of the most creative people in the world are Geminis. And I'm going to go on later as we get into the show. I'll read you some names of famous people who are Geminis, and you'll say, oh, well, no wonder. They are very creative, very prolific. They make excellent broadcasters, excellent writers, excellent teachers, excellent presenters, anything that has to do with communicating. Politicians as well. We've got several politicians who have strong Geminis, who are strong Geminis, and they love to hear themselves talk, and they are good talkers, quick on their feet, but not deep necessarily. And I can't stress the fact that I'm not trying to make a generalization here. It's just that they're not that deep. What I mean by that is that because their minds are so quick to change, you may get started on a very serious conversation with a Gemini, and because of the nature of their thought process, you may be on to the next topic before you even finish the last one. So if you're a slow-moving person who likes long, slow, leisurely conversations that sort of take on their time and have a simple rapport back and forth, you may not find that with a Gemini. You may find that things move so quickly that the train of thought is very much bound up by the way that their very personality. Matter of fact, the web, the World Wide Web, the internet, is a very good place for a Gemini to spend time because the simple nature that you can go off in so many different tangents really plays into their whole realm and their whole method, their whole modus operandi, their whole pattern of thought process is entirely driven by that. You see this boom, 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 jumping from one link to the next link to the next link, and they may not be related. There may not be a logical sweep of ideas going through that train of thought. They may be jumping from one flower seeds to train parts to, you know, airplanes to Alaska, anywhere you want to go. They would just, that is the nature of the Gemini. And it's ruled by Mercury. Mercury is the planet that rules Gemini, and Mercury is known for not only the element but also the planet is known for what's called quicksilver, that quicksilver where it never stays still. If you've ever seen Mercury when you're in high school in your chemistry class and they brought out some mercury and you tried to hold it in your hand, you saw how it would just scatter and went all over the place. It just completely has that same quality. That is indicative of what a Gemini is. It's that fast-moving, quickly spurred, dispersed, quickly dispersed, live kind of quality where the events and the ideas and the concepts just bounce around in their head like a pinball machine. It's just exactly what it's like. Inside of a Gemini's head is very much like a pinball machine. It's ding, 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 ding. The bells are going off, the flippers are flipping, and it's constant state of turmoil and constant state of churn in that regard. And it's very, very exciting and can be a wonderful place to be if you're of a mind to be it. If you're a slow-moving person and you want a long, slow, methodical conversation, you're not going to get that with a Gemini. You're going to get very, very quick, on-the-fly ideas. Now, as a result of that, they can be very busy, as I mentioned. They can be cluttered. They can be distracted easily. All those things are applicable. But of course, don't forget, a lot depends upon what other characteristics there are in the chart. This is where it gets to be very critical. You may know a Gemini who has a Gemini in a certain house, and we're going to go through the houses in a few minutes. You may know somebody, you say they're not that way at all. That may be based on the other components of their chart. If you have strong Gemini qualities in your chart, this will be the case. But trust me, I know several people who are like this and they fit the bill perfectly. So let's go through the houses and where Gemini lands in the houses, okay? Because with the sun, based on the time of birth, don't forget I keep talking about the time of birth. The time of birth is what sets what's called as the ascendant. This is what's on the horizon at the time of birth. You can be a Gemini, but you could have Scorpio rising. You could be a Gemini and have Aquarius rising. This is the ascendant, the rising sign. You could be any number of different signs depending upon the time that you were born. This is why, and those two components taken together give a very accurate composite impression of who the individual is, who the person is. It's very, very critical to know that. That's why I always talk about the time of birth. When you know the time of birth and you know the sun sign, you're going to get two planets, two signs together that you can then combine. And when you read astrology or you look up astrology anywhere, you read those two together, you're going to have much more granular precision and accuracy with that regard. So always keep that in mind. So when I talk about this, this is what changes where the sun is in those different houses. So when we talk about sun in the first house, Gemini in the first house, we're going to see somebody who expresses all those characteristics that I mentioned. Someone who's a broadcaster, somebody who's a teacher, someone who's a writer, someone who communicates by the very virtue of who they are. They just communicate. Gemini rising, Gemini sun in the first house, they're going to be a very strong person. This is a person who will be incessantly curious, incessantly researching, incessantly looking for something, moving on all the time to something new. All the time something new. Moving, 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 moving. This is very much of a, just like I said, Mercury, Quicksilver. What's Mercury when we think of Greek mythology? Mercury was the fleet-footed messenger, the one that was the messenger that went out there and got everybody and flew around, dashed from place to place. And that's why Mercury is the ruler and is the ruling planet of Gemini. Mercury also rules Virgo, and we'll get into that when we get down the road further and we start talking about Virgo. We'll also mention that there because there are some similarities there. But, so we're talking about Gemini in the first house. Gemini sun in the first house is a person who's incredibly talkative, loves to communicate, loves to be out there, can be the life of the party, can be a social butterfly, can be a very, very good person to have at a party because they will always get conversations going. If you have a dinner party and you have a Gemini at the dinner party, don't be surprised if they dominate the conversation or keep that whole conversation moving, and they will be widely versed in a very broad array of topics. They will know a little bit about a lot. That doesn't mean that they know everything about everything, but they'll know a little bit about a wide array of topics. So this is important. They are able to converse very comfortably in that realm. Next, we look at Gemini in the second house. The second house is the house that dictates money and how money is used. So we might find a person who, a Gemini sun in the second house, either deals in the banking industry, does banking presentations, works with financial people to do educational training perhaps about someone who's in a position of authority and a position of divulging information or presenting information, delivering messaging, being the messenger for the financial industry. So you might find someone doing financial public relations. You might find somebody being a financial writer. You might find somebody who has a show, a television show about finances or all those kinds of topics. So you combine the idea of communication and the idea of money together, and that's who you'd get for a second house, somebody who's born in the second house with Gemini and the sun in the second house. When Gemini moves to the third house, this is the house that Gemini actually rules. So if you've got a person with a sun in the third house, you've got a very, very powerful writer. You've got a person who communicates. You've got a public relations person. You've got a rock and roll person who loves to create. You've got a broadcaster. You've got a musician. You've got writers. You've got teachers. You've got people who love to present. Anybody who loves the public forum and is comfortable in front of a stage and able to communicate. This is a person maybe who does a blog for a living. Somebody who's on the internet doing internet work in that kind of capacity. Very much the case. They love that curiosity factor, and this is an area where they really, really excel. When we look at Gemini in the fourth house is the house of family. The Gemini in the house of the family may find somebody who's got a very, very busy household. There's lots going on inside that house and that family. That family is constantly, some families have a dynamic where there's always stuff going on, jokes are being passed back and forth, and there's lots of activity and conversation and a swirl of activity. Other families are very sedate and quiet. The Gemini and the Gemini sun, if they're in that family, they are going to be the one that is in the car talking. They're the one that's going to be, bouncing up and down the stairs. They're the ones going to be watching them writing and communicating. This is a very strong component. So again, family, communication, that's where those two merge together, is when the sun is in the fourth house in Gemini. When Gemini moves to the fifth house, which is the house of creativity and children, we find a Gemini sun in the fifth house to be incredibly creative. This is a person who is creative. So all that nervous energy comes flying out in creative ways. So we might find somebody who's an artist who creates music or has lots of ideas, or an actor, perhaps, an actor who loves getting up on stage and talking, a communicator who expresses their creativity through the use of words. So again, writers would be good there, especially people who write for a living, not necessarily writers who write for business or newspapers like you might find in the third house, which is more about communication. This would be the creative writer. This might be the poet. This might be the teacher. This might be the novelist, someone who writes for a living, or writes movie scripts. Someone who's in the movie business would also, because it's about creativity. So creativity and communication, when they come together, that's where you'll find the sun in the 5th house in Gemini. When we move to the 6th house, the 6th house is the house of service, and it's the house of daily work. So here we might find somebody with a sun in Gemini who's a teacher, because their daily work is dictated by communicating to others. This is how they communicate. They communicate to a class. Now class, put away your books. Now class, time for recess, that sort of thing, as well as lecturing. Also, a Gemini in this capacity might be somebody who's very good helping others with regard to helping to words. Someone who's able to craft public relations, again, would be a very good area for this person to be, because they are working to help somebody create an image of who they are, working with words on a daily basis, doing research, doing that curiosity piece, doing that, and able to multitask. So somebody who is able to multitask, like perhaps a short order cook, where you're doing this and that and this and that all at the same time, might do very well with regard to the 6th house, which is where we'd find the sun in the 6th house, is somebody who's always got their eyes on the communication piece and moving very quickly. When we move to the 7th house is exactly the opposite of the first, as I mentioned earlier. The 7th house is the house of relationships. A person with a Gemini sun in the 7th house is going to be looking for somebody, believe it or not, who is able to keep up with them. So the best relationship for a Gemini sun in the 7th house is somebody who has a similar quality of curiosity or air quality, or that strong communication quality. So you might find somebody involved with a Libra or an Aquarius who are also air signs, different kind of air sign, but they still have that quality there. So you might find a Gemini very driven by what brings them together with another person might be the conversation. So you know, sometimes relationships are based on many different qualities. Relationships, when they are formed by the intellect, tend to be those that are bounded by friendship, because intellect brings them together. They share a lot in common. When people bring that commonality together into that world, we will find that to be a very strong component of what makes that relationship successful or not successful. If a person has a Gemini in the 7th house, they are going to be incredibly motivated towards the ability to communicate with their partner. That ability to communicate will dictate the success or failure of that relationship. The next house we come to is the 8th house. The 8th house is the house of spirituality. It's the house of big organizations. It's the house of outside resources. Here's where you might find a Gemini working in an organization of people who are dealing with, perhaps in the realm of religion. You might be somebody who is a pastor or a minister who loves to get up and deliver the word by speaking publicly as a messenger. Again, this is the world of spirituality. It's also the 8th house also rules large organizations and outside resources. So this might be somebody who does a lobbying. A lobbyist would be an excellent person in the 8th house, because they are using other people's money to wield power and to manipulate. So that's where you might find somebody, again, communication, spirituality, outside resources, where they come together. That's where you'll find that Gemini. When we go to Gemini in the 9th house, this is an excellent house for a Gemini. A Gemini sun in the 9th house is excellent because it gives them a perfect stage from which to deliver. It's the house of school. It's the house of education. It's the house of travel. So a Gemini loves to travel because why? Because the stimulation is always turning. You take a Gemini who's in the travel industry, for example, and they are working with helping people plan trips, or they're working on setting up seminars. This is an excellent place for a Gemini sun to be, and you'll find these people are the ones that love to travel. You may find flight attendants here. You may find people who love to travel and be tour guides. This is an excellent spot. If you're a Gemini and you're a tour guide, you're in your glory, because you're able to use your voice, communication, to express the travel. And the travel is always, when you're traveling, every day is different. You're someplace different. There's new stimuli. This is a very fertile playground for a Gemini to live in. They love the world of the education, and they do very well because they're so curious. That constant need for new information coming in, that absorption of ideas, the absorption and the influx of ideas coming through and out again. So they act like a conduit in that regard, where all of this information comes in and they are the messenger that delivers it back out again. So it's very strong component, and an excellent place for a person who has a Gemini sun. If the sun is in Gemini, this person is most likely a teacher, or most likely works in the travel industry, or has that sort of idea. So you think of education and travel and communication, how those fit together, and you tease the story out. That's where you'll find the Gemini in the 9th house. When we move to the 10th house is the house of career. So obviously, a Gemini in the 10th house with a sun in the 10th house is going to be more than likely sitting behind a camera. My midheaven, my 10th house is in Gemini, but that's not the same as having a planet there. But it's true for someone like myself. It's a very strong component because they enjoy being in front of the camera, are comfortable in front of the camera, are comfortable delivering messages, are comfortable presenting. So a person with a Gemini in the 10th house is going to be incredibly creative, is going to be incredibly very good communicator. They will be good with regard to managing lots of different tasks, as I said. You'll expect them to be able to manage many things, so you'll have a very efficient person, a person that you can keep throwing stuff at, and they'll more than likely be able to pick up the thing. Because again, they have that ability to juggle. They can take many different topics and juggle and juggle and juggle and keep them going, swirling around, swirling around, swirling around in this constant barrage of ideas. But they are able to multitask. Multitask is probably the most key word when it comes to talking about a Gemini. Multitask, multifaceted, multi-interested, curious to the max. Every one of those things are there. So communication and occupation. When you put those two together, what do you get? You get a news broadcaster, you get a reporter, you get a writer, you get a blogger, you get any number of those things in that area. The next house we move to is the 11th house. The 11th house is the house of groups and group associations, business associations. So a person with a Gemini in the 11th house would be a person who is a good collaborator, one who shares ideas. And you know, Gemini is going to have a ton of ideas. They are going to be constantly turning over these ideas. This is a very strong component of the Gemini, and they will always have that spark. That spark of curiosity is always boom, 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 boom. And depending upon what's happening in the life of the Gemini, these things will be activated by the planets, which is only shown by the individual natal chart through the eyes of an accomplished astrologer, someone such as myself who knows how to interpret the chart. TurningOfTheWheel.com is my website if you're interested. When we look at the Gemini in the 11th house, we find somebody who does very well in group settings, someone who's who enjoys the group setting. Not everybody likes to be in the group. Some people enjoy being by themselves, isolated, working by themselves. Other people enjoy the repartee that comes with working with other people, and that's sort of that sense of, you know, the camaraderie and teamwork, and being part of a team is very important. If that person is on a team, and say you're in the software business or the banking business and you're in team meetings, that person will always have ideas, that person will always be talking, that person will always have some sort of spark that gets the conversation going. Be aware of that. The final house we come to is the house of transition. The house of transition is the 12th house. When we have the sun and Gemini in the 12th house, we have a person who is always on the brink of beginning and ending. There's that seesaw effect of people who tend to initiate and people who tend to wind things up. Now, this is where the closer comes in, the person who is able to close things. What I mean by that is sort of bring the contracts in and get them signed. You know, the closer. Someone who has the 12th house, but the 12th house is also ruled by transition. And transition is that sort of the boundary between living and the dead. So there's that area that people are always afraid of. But I come back to the same analogy of the pregnancy. When you come to the end of a pregnancy, yes, it is a transition. And transition means what? Transition means from one position or one state to another. That's what transition is. It's from one state to another. The end of a pregnancy is the birth of a baby. The birth of a baby is a wonderful thing, so transition should not be viewed as something scary. So the Gemini in this person is talkative, is able to communicate in areas dealing with this realm. This is a realm that many people are uncomfortable with, but the Gemini is comfortable in this realm. They are able to make the transition. They're able to make that concept. They're able to talk about that, and very successfully in that regard. They're good starters, and they're also good finishers. So there's a lot of qualities that are good there. Let's get into some of the names of famous people who fit this bill that I've spoken to. Now, I don't know all the details, but I bet you if I were to draw up their charts, I could tell you which houses their sons were in based on who they are as individuals. So when we look at famous Geminis, There's quite a slew of them. Many of them are very highly creative people. The first one that comes to mind is Paul McCartney of the Beatles. Paul McCartney is incredibly prolific, very quick-witted, very quick on his feet. You've ever seen interviews with him? He talks very quickly. He's always got an idea. He's sort of out there, you know, and he's not real deep. Now, people may argue with that, but as a rule, he's very much of a top-line person. It took someone like a John Lennon, who was much deeper, to get into that deeper concepts that you saw when you saw the Beatles. Miles Davis, the famous trumpeter, very, very controversial, very much of a trendsetter, highly creative. He broke the rules 5 or 6 times. He reinvented music 3 or 4 different times over the course of his time. Prince is another musician who's very well known for being that quick thinking, highly creative, spontaneous kind of person who does very well in that creative realm. Bob Dylan is another one who's incredibly much of a Gemini kind of person. They have that strong sense of, you know, he's got the marvelous sense of words. Look at the way in the words that he spins out. His poems have been regarded as some of the finest prose of the 20th and 21st century. He is incredibly prolific, still at his age, getting close to 70, still kicking out albums and still turning out music left and right, still touring, always moving, always thinking, always writing. Highly creative people. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys is another Gemini. So we see this trend in these highly creative people. They probably all have the sun in the 5th house or somewhere like the 5th or 10th house. I don't know that for a fact, but I can tell you that's probably the case. Marilyn Monroe and JFK were both Geminis. JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe. We know that they had a spark between them, and they had that strong, strong quality. When we look at, and here's someone you're definitely going to know, Donald Trump is a Gemini. Now, Donald Trump is a Gemini like you've never heard about. He loves to talk. He loves to hear himself talk. He is not very deep. As we know, he's not real deep on substance. We see him out there, and we see all of these things about him as a very, very superficial kind of person. A lot of talk, a lot of verbiage, but not a lot of substance behind the outside. A lot of talk, not much substance. That is very typical of some Geminis, and they use that stage, that bully pulpit, to get up there and talk. He's got that strong kind of quality about him. Kendrick Lamar is also a Gemini, as is Marco Rubio. Now, you remember in the debates when Marco Rubio and Donald Trump were arguing, you could see that quick over-talking. They were talking over each other left and right, left and right. That is very much of a Gemini. Geminis can't interrupt. They can't sustain. They can't contain the ability to communicate. It is almost virtually impossible for them to stop communicating. They have to communicate at all times. So if you ask a Gemini an opinion, you're going to get an opinion and then some. They just can't not talk. I mean, that's not a criticism, just a fact of life. They are born to talk, and they will talk, and they will talk. So this is why they're good on talk shows. This is why they're good on television. This is why they're good writers. All these characteristics are true. One more interesting Gemini was Paul Gauguin, the famous painter who was friends with Vincent van Gogh. They didn't always get along, but they had a great sense of rapport between themselves. They were fiery and had a great sense of creativity. Creativity is an important part of what it means to be a Gemini. It's that ability to churn over, that curiosity, the ideas, always churning over, always churning over. And the way to find this out, everybody has a piece of their pie that is in Gemini, and some of you have planets that are there, some of you don't. The way to find that out is to contact me. turningofthewheel.com is my website. I'm on Facebook, I'm on YouTube. This is where you'll find me. Contact me, get your chart done, and I can tell you exactly what's going on. Or if you know someone who fits the characteristics I mentioned, Gemini is probably their case. You need to know the birth date, the birthplace, and most importantly, the birth time. When you know those 3 components, you can figure out where this is, because we all have a piece of this in our lives. I encourage you to visit my website, turningofthewheel.com or turningofthewheel.tv, and you'll find educational videos there and lots of information. And I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks so much.